let me jump back 500 to 1,000 years and just spend a few minutes on the role of migration and freedom. And this is, you can skip ahead if you desperately don't like history, but this is from a book called Property and Freedom by Richard Pipes, who's a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union. And it's a fascinating book. And in one of the chapters looking at the history of this, in the medieval times, the cities gained freedom from local princes. This was the story that I've told elsewhere. The Hanseatic League, for example, the effort of self-governing cities that grew throughout medieval Europe. And in these self-governing, self-judging communes that were independent of the local landlords, people could migrate. In those cities, everybody, all the men, could participate in the assemblies that basically passed the laws. This was a long German custom. Then we're talking about the 11th, 12th, 13th century. These migrants to the cities, including runaway serfs from the countryside, were considered free after they lived in the city for a year and a day. So they went from being serfs, where they basically were tied to the land and to their landlord. By running away, living in a city, they became freemen. They controlled their life, their liberty, their property, they had self-ownership. And the dynamic growth of cities and trade is a big part of what developed Western Europe in the, again, through the early medieval time. Richard Pipes writes, trade along with manufacturing and the capital, that is the investment, both gave rise to the cities they created in the midst of this agrarian medieval society, which was based on duties and privileges. You know, you had a duty to your landlord and he had duties to you in time of famine and so forth. But cities were oases of liberty based on rights. And the very important development in Western history, and migration was a part of this. People migrate away from oppression and toward freedom. Now, this city independence ended. Modern democracy, Pipes argues, originated in these medieval towns where property rights and commerce were protected by law, by the rule of law, that should say. Now, if you studied history, you know that the Greeks and the Romans and biblical times influenced very much the founders in the modern world. But Pipes is arguing that this is another major source and perhaps more important for developing our sort of commercial culture and our protections. Through the 14th and 15th centuries, the nation states arose, and once they had gunpowder, so the local king or prince could blow down the walls that were protecting the cities tended to lose their autonomy, and this sort of age ended. But in the 16th, 17th century, he argues, where absolutism, where Louis the Sun King and all these kings had no tolerance for the long traditions in the cities. In Novgorod, for example, was wiped out by Ivan the Terrible in Russia, and much of this city history, was lost. But Pipes argues that the ideals of the city had fostered the institutions that created the intrinsic part of Western political tradition. And I mention all this just because it's fascinating in and of itself. I encourage you to get Richard Pipes' Property and Freedom. I think it's fascinating. But also, migration played a role in this. People migrated throughout the ancient world. Migrations from one place to the other were common. And migrating toward places of prosperity is one of the things that drove economic development. Now, moving forward, more recently, 3 books I'd recommend. Triumph of the City by Edward Glaser. This is a story right now around the world. Migration is the biggest story in the world, or the biggest reality in the world for economic development. Hundreds of millions of people are migrating to cities. In China, there's something like 200 million in their floating population that has migrated illegally to the cities, to the factories, to the textile mills, and others to make your iPhones and iPods. That's a huge part of Chinese economic development. They don't know how to handle it. They tolerate it, but it's generally illegal. In India, millions and millions, tens, hundreds of millions are migrating to the big cities in India where the jobs are. Now, in Africa, much the same, giant shanty towns of millions of people outside of Nairobi and Lagos, Nigeria. And people say, well, that's terrible, these shanty towns. But as Glaser argues, for most of the people, it's better than what they had. That is, they're migrating from rural poverty where they have no running water, no electricity, to the shanty towns where at least they have some running water and some electricity, and they have better job opportunities. Arrival City by Doug Saunders tells this story as well of migration. And in both these cases, in China, India, and in Africa, that is Nigeria and Ghana and Kenya, this is legal migration. Well, not in China, but in the others, legal migration. People are moving to the city. So cities are the source of prosperity, and I'll have more on this. But this is what happened in America through the late 1800s, early 1900s. Millions, tens of millions migrated from the countryside to the city. Japan as well, and through Western Europe, and that developed the cities, the factories, and so forth. Borderless Economics by Robert Guest, the economics editor, business editor of The Economist, writes on this migration as well as international trade and investment around the world. He looks at the Chinese sea turtles, who are the Chinese entrepreneurs who had left China in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, prospered in Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, the US, Indonesia, and then came back to invest in China after the reforms under Deng Xiaoping. So one of the things migration does is boost economic development, both in the countries they go to, but also in the countries where they send their ideas, expertise, and investment back later. So more recent books, fascinating, highly recommended. Borderless Economics. Guest argues that migration helps us. This is Chen Yan of China. She's in the U.S. visiting. She sees people throwing paper away right and left. She starts Nine Dragons Paper. She's now worth $1.6 billion. Basically, she organized a system where paper is collected and shipped back to China to be processed. Similarly, lots of raw materials, lots of recycling from here goes to China, goes to India, where those goods are more valuable there than here. Sergey Brin, son of Russian immigrants, starts Google, the Similar and PayPal, eBay, Sun Microsystems. These are all countries founded by immigrants or have immigrants in key position. Like 50% of the Silicon Valley companies are founded by immigrants or have their key technology information officers or immigrants. Renew, what does that say? RenewOurEconomy.org is a advocacy organization that calls for immigration reform. This is Mayor Bloomberg in New York was involved with this. Some of his key people were in this. This is one of many resources advocating reform of the status quo for economic reasons. The tech people want access to more immigrants who could work for their companies. Field of Dreams, if you build a free society, people will come. This is from the movie, so presumably if you build a baseball field anywhere, people will come and play baseball. But if you build a market economy that's free, places like Hong Kong that were very poor in the 50s, they have very low taxes, very low trade barriers, and people come by the millions from China and elsewhere to build their companies there. Same with open areas. Dubai is, in the middle of the usually authoritarian Middle East. They built this free enterprise oasis with low taxes, and now there's huge investment there, and from people all over the world who come to take advantage of that relatively free society for that area. So let's look more at the history. Again, if you don't like history, you can move ahead. But in the 1700s, the Scottish Enlightenment, American colonies are sort of left to self-order. So people come here for various reasons. They start businesses. They ship timber and beaver pelts and other things back to the old world. Government doesn't have much to do with it. This is a self-ordering system. Then comes intense nationalism and war for England, France, and Spain, and those wars are disruptive and expensive. England is also, the war spread to the U.S., where England and France are battling over their territories here, and when England tries to regulate the colonies and raise taxes to cover the French and Indian War, that leads to revolution and independence in the U.S. The 1850s, that's after the Napoleonic Wars, to the 1915, this is the area of globalization. There's a century of relative peace in Europe, expanding flows of goods, trades around the world. There's technology advancements as ships get more and more capable. There's investment in migration flows, and particularly since the 1870s, 70–80% drop in the cost of transporting goods and people. So migration expands dramatically around the world from the 1870s on. But also with that rapid boost in migration and trade, there's a fear of resource depletion. In England, they're afraid they're going to run out of coal. There was a fear also of overproduction, that the factories are so efficient. Where are they going to sell all these clothes that they make in England, English textile mills? And that led to sort of imperialism and colonialism, where European industrialized countries tried to grab ownership, not just trade with countries in Africa and Asia, but actually own them militarily or control them militarily as a way to get markets. So German colonies would have to buy from German corporations, and raw materials and cotton from those countries would have to be shipped to Germany to process. So each of these countries, because they lost faith in free trade and free enterprise, they, through their military, tried to control markets where people would buy their goods, as well as get access to raw materials, fearing that their factories would run out of the raw materials they need. So this is an unfortunate time that led to these problems around the world. And the U.S. Got on this train as well with the Spanish-American War, the late 1800s, and U.S. began to also collect colonies, the Philippines, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and others. Not in the same way that the European nation states did, but in a big way from American tradition. So again, history, we go into World War I, which is this cataclysm that these frictions led to, followed by the Great Depression and then World War II. And it's only in the 1950s and 60s that there's sort of a return to sanity in the sense of global integration, of lowering trade barriers, lowering investment barriers, and increasing migration, that is, lowering immigration barriers. So from the 70s on is when we really expanded our openness to immigration. And as trade grew, also again, we got this new fear of running out of resources. Students may not know this as well, but in the 70s, when the environmental movement started, the key reason for recycling was a fear that we were running out of raw materials, that there wasn't going to be enough copper and aluminum and iron for American factories. We had to recycle. There was a fear we were going to run out of oil. Sort of similar to the fear of running out of coal earlier. So a lot of our environmental policies, recycling policies, and others were based on this fear of running out of resources that in many ways reflects the fear of the 1870s of running out of resources. So it's sort of a strange recurrence of that. And these fears are misplaced, economists argue, because of the nature of enterprise and innovation. Okay. So what are the causes of economic growth? Why do some countries boom? Why did Scotland move from poverty to prosperity from the 1700s and 1800s? Or Ireland move from poverty through much of the 1900s? In the 1960s and 70s and 80s, Ireland's one of the poorest countries in Western Europe, but by 2005, it's one of the wealthiest countries in Western Europe. How did Ireland change so rapidly, so dramatically? Well, economists argue it's economic policy. There's the finding treasure pattern for economic growth. The gold rush in America's West, how are you going to get rich? You find gold and you're panning gold and suddenly you're wealthy. Similarly, in Saudi Arabia, they find black gold under the ground. Or Jed Clampett finding gold in, I guess it's Oklahoma, shooting at a rabbit and he finds gold bubbling up. So there's that pattern of finding wealth in some countries. Spain and Portugal, it was finding treasure in the New World, wiping out Native American colonies in Central and South America or societies and just taking all their gold, melting down their artifacts and bringing it back. So that was another way to create or find wealth, basically take it. But the economic success story of the 17th century wasn't a finding treasure model of Portugal and Spain. Instead, it was Holland and Amsterdam. This was a place, country that's significantly underwater. They had to build dikes to hold the water out for agriculture and to grow flowers. But Holland became suddenly wealthy. And the question is, why? How? How did that happen? Whoops. If you're wondering why I have a Seinfeld segment here in this section, they're talking in the restaurant, and he's saying, uh, "What is the Netherlands?" and "What's Holland?" and "Who are the Dutch?" And they're all confused. Well, Holland and Netherlands and the Dutch have a sort of strange history, which is why the country seems confusing. But the story of that is actually quite interesting. This Cato Policy Report from 1998 has a review article that looks at the movement of capital and people as a core to economic growth. Holland didn't get rich just because the Dutch people who'd been there forever suddenly woke up one day and started working harder or learning new skills. It happened in part through this sort of independent city-state tradition, as I mentioned earlier, and the business people in the community. Basically, we'd had these huge wars across Europe with Catholics and Protestants killing each other by the millions, or their governments forcing them to kill each other. You had famine and pestilence following the wars. In Holland, you had as a sort of response to this, a toleration. This was a place that was business focused, run by business people, focused on trade, and a toleration for people of all religions. So people came from all over the world. The Armenians, the Chinese, Huguenots, and Jews. They emigrated from places with less tolerance and less economic freedom to Holland, where they not only brought their capital, their accumulated wealth, they brought their knowledge, their energy, and their trading networks. So they're driven out of their homeland. Brenner argues by politics and regulations. They came to a place where they were freer, and they helped boost that economy. Funding a trading network that brought commerce from all around the world. So the Dutch were the first European republic, both tolerant to all religions and sound property rights.